She thought she had it all, until one night, her life turned into a nightmare. A betrayal so brutal, it could have cost her everything. But just when all hope seemed lost, a stranger appeared, changing everything.
Who was he?
And how did he save her from the unimaginable? Stay with us to uncover the chilling truth in this true crime story. You won't believe what happened next. It started like any other day. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Their home was quiet, peaceful. A small cottage on the edge of a sleepy town. They had been married for 5 years. At first, it was perfect. He was charming, kind, attentive. She felt lucky. Her name was Sarah, and she loved him deeply. He was everything she had ever wanted. They'd spent their days in laughter, their nights in whispered dreams. But something was changing. It started with the little things. A glance that lingered too long. A tone that wasn't quite right. At first, she thought it was her imagination. She tried to brush it off. But soon, the tension grew thicker. The air in their home felt heavy. The walls seemed to close in. It wasn't just the way he spoke to her anymore. It was the silence, the absence of affection. Her heart began to race whenever he was near. She tried to ignore it, but it gnawed at her soul. One evening, she decided to confront him. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at his hands. She walked in, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong," she said softly. He didn't look up. Then he smiled. A strange, cold smile. She felt her stomach twist. He stood up, slowly, his gaze never leaving her. "You don't understand, do you?" he whispered. She frowned. Her pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" she asked. His eyes darkened. And then he did the unthinkable. The words that followed sent a chill through her bones. Her legs buckled beneath her. She couldn't breathe. Her heart was pounding so loud she couldn't hear anything else. The world around her seemed to spin. Everything froze. For a moment, it was as if the whole house held its breath. And then the air crackled with an eerie, suffocating tension. She couldn't believe what she had just heard, what he had just said. Her entire body went numb. She backed away slowly, trying to make sense of it, but nothing made sense anymore. Her mind was racing, her thoughts scattered. The person she thought she knew, her husband, was no longer the man she had married. Something else lurked beneath the surface. Something dark. Her eyes scanned the room, desperate for something familiar. Something that could bring her back to reality. But the shadows seemed to grow longer, deeper. He took a step forward. His expression was unreadable, as though he were studying her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The silence stretched, suffocating. It felt like an eternity before he spoke again. His voice was low, barely audible. "I've been planning this for a long time, Sarah." His words wrapped around her like a vice. Her legs wobbled beneath her. "What do you mean?" she managed to whisper. But even as she spoke, she knew the answer. A horrible, gut-wrenching clarity flooded her mind. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted, was a stranger. He wasn't who he had appeared to be. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. He was dangerous. She could see it now in his eyes, the cold, unfeeling glint. A shiver ran down her spine. "Why?" Her voice broke, the word escaping her lips like a prayer. His smile deepened, twisted. "I never loved you," he said. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Her heart stopped. Her mind couldn't process it. Her husband, the man she had built a life with, had never loved her. It felt like the world was falling apart around her. Everything she had known, everything she had believed, shattered in an instant. She stumbled back, bumping into the chair behind her. Her breathing became shallow, rapid. She needed to leave, but there was nowhere to go. He was blocking the doorway. She could see the gleam of something in his hand. Her pulse quickened. Her stomach turned. Her mind screamed at her to run, to escape. but her body wouldn't move. She was paralyzed with fear, unable to tear her gaze from his cold, calculating eyes. The room seemed to grow smaller, suffocating her. Her thoughts became jumbled. There was no escaping now. He had already made up his mind. Her heart was hammering against her chest, each beat deafening in her ears. The room felt stifling, closing in with every passing second. Her legs finally obeyed, urging her to retreat, to run, but she couldn't move fast enough. His figure blocked the exit, towering over her with an unsettling calmness. His grip tightened on the object in his hand. The gleam of steel caught the light, sending a flash of terror through her. She wanted to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Her voice was gone, swallowed by the terror that paralyzed her. "Sarah," he said again, his voice almost tender now, as if this was all some sick game. "Don't be scared." She stared at him, wide-eyed, but couldn't find the strength to speak. Her throat was dry, constricted. All she could do was breathe, shallow, ragged breaths. Her mind raced, seeking any way out. But there was no escape. She was trapped in the very place she once felt safe, with the man she thought she knew. Her husband. The man who was now a stranger with darkness in his soul. A flicker of movement in his hand, and the knife gleamed once more. "I never wanted this," he whispered. Her eyes welled with tears, the truth sinking in like 1,000 needles. The man she had loved had been hiding a monster all along. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she reached for the nearest object. A vase. She grabbed it, her fingers numb from fear. But before she could make a move, he stepped forward. His face was emotionless, devoid of any humanity. The knife was raised. And in that moment, her entire world crumbled. The weight of the realization sank deep within her chest. There would be no escape. Not from him. Not from the nightmare that had unfolded in front of her. She closed her eyes, feeling the cold sting of hopelessness wash over her. She could already hear the faint sound of her own heartbeat, each thump growing weaker. And then everything went still. The air seemed to freeze. The room, once so familiar, now felt like a foreign land. Her heart was breaking piece by piece, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Time seemed to stretch, and in the silence, Sarah could feel her heart sinking into an abyss of fear. Her thoughts became jumbled, spinning in a haze of panic and disbelief. What had gone wrong? How had everything changed so suddenly? The man in front of her, her husband, seemed so cold, so distant. There was no trace of the man she had fallen in love with. He was unrecognizable, a shadow of the person she had once trusted with her heart. The knife in his hand gleamed in the dim light, like a dark omen, its sharp edge promising a fate Sarah couldn't escape. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why are you doing this?" But he didn't answer. His lips curled into that same twisted smile, and his eyes burned with a cold, detached cruelty. "Because I can," he said simply, his voice devoid of emotion. It was as though her life, her very existence, had never mattered to him. Her world, once so vibrant, now felt hollow and meaningless. She could feel the tears gathering in her eyes, blurring her vision. But she couldn't let herself cry. Not now. Not when she was so close to the edge. Her thoughts raced faster now. Could she fight back? Could she escape? But every possible escape seemed to fade into nothingness, like the very air around her had conspired to trap her in this nightmare. He took a step closer. The space between them was shrinking with every heartbeat. She couldn't move. Her legs felt like lead, her body frozen in place, caught in the grip of terror. His presence was suffocating, a dark force that seemed to drain the light from the room. She couldn't even bring herself to scream. She was helpless, at his mercy. And he knew it. The room, once so warm and inviting, felt like a cold prison now. Sarah's pulse thudded in her ears as he moved closer, his eyes locked onto hers, unblinking. A chill ran down her spine. Suddenly, he raised the knife, and the air seemed to crackle with impending violence. Sarah braced herself, her breath shallow and quick, her mind a blur of confusion and dread. She couldn't look away from the knife, couldn't pull her gaze from the danger that was so close, too close. Her entire world focused on that blade, gleaming in the dim light like an extension of the darkness within him. And then, just as he lunged forward, the door behind her burst open. The door slammed against the wall with a force that echoed through the house. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. He froze, too. The knife hovered in midair, a deadly promise still in his hand. Her heart pounded in her chest, the rush of adrenaline flooding her senses. She couldn't believe what was happening. Her eyes darted toward the door. A figure stood there, silhouette framed by the dim light from the hallway. It was a man she didn't recognize at first, but his voice cut through the tension. "Sarah, move," he shouted. Without thinking, she stumbled backward, her legs still shaky with fear. The figure moved quickly, rushing into the room, his eyes locked on her husband. Her husband, the man who had once been everything to her, now stood with that cold smile, unmoving. A moment of stunned silence passed. Then, in one fluid motion, the stranger lunged toward him. They collided with a force that knocked the knife from his hand. The sound of flesh hitting flesh was sickening, but Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away. The stranger, whoever he was, grappled with her husband, pushing him back with brute strength. Her mind couldn't process what was happening. She could hardly breathe, could hardly think. All she knew was that the knife was no longer in his hand, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt a flicker of hope. The two men struggled violently, crashing into the furniture, the noise deafening in the small room. The stranger fought with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, locking her husband in a hold that made him gasp for air. Sarah stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Should she help? Should she run? Her hands shook as she clutched the edge of the table, trying to steady herself. But before she could decide, the stranger spoke again, his voice firm, commanding. "Sarah, get out of here. Now." His words broke through the fog in her mind, and her body finally moved. She didn't think. She just ran. She bolted toward the door, her heart racing, her pulse in her throat. She didn't look back. Couldn't look back. She burst through the door, out into the night, gasping for air. The cold hit her like a slap, but she didn't care. She ran down the narrow path, the gravel crunching beneath her feet. Her mind was still reeling, struggling to catch up with the chaos she had just witnessed. What had just happened? Who was that man? Was she safe now? But then, in the distance, she heard the sound of sirens. Her heart sank again, the weight of the situation crashing down on her. The nightmare wasn't over. Not yet. The sound of the sirens grew louder, cutting through the cold night air. Sarah's legs burned as she ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her mind was still a whirlwind of confusion, terror, and disbelief. She couldn't think clearly. She couldn't make sense of anything. Who was the stranger? Why had he been there? How had he known to come when he did? Her thoughts were a mess, but one thing was clear. She had to get away. She could still hear the commotion behind her, the sounds of struggling and shouting, but she didn't dare look back. The gravel underfoot turned to pavement, and she kept running, her body pushed to its limits. The flashing lights of the police cars reflected off the nearby houses as they raced toward her. She didn't slow down. Her entire world had just been ripped apart, and she wasn't ready to face it yet. Not until she could make sense of what had happened, until she was far enough away from the house that held all the memories of her shattered marriage. Her heart thudded in her chest, each beat a painful reminder of the chaos she had just narrowly escaped. She turned a corner, and the sound of the sirens seemed to fade. The chill in the air settled into her bones, but she didn't stop. She needed to get to safety. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she collapsed on the steps of a nearby convenience store, gasping for breath. Her knees were weak, and her chest ached. Her body trembled from the shock, but she didn't care. All that mattered was that she was away from him, away from the man she had married, the man who had turned into a monster. The door to the store swung open, and an older woman stepped out, looking at Sarah with concern. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked gently. Sarah could only nod, too overwhelmed to
speak.
The woman didn't press, but she offered Sarah a comforting smile. "Come inside, warm up," she said kindly. Without a word, Sarah stumbled to her feet and followed the woman into the store. The warmth inside felt like a blessing, but it couldn't erase the cold terror that still gripped her heart. The woman offered her a seat, and Sarah sank into it, her hands shaking as she wrapped them around her body. Tears stung her eyes, but she held them back. She didn't want to break down. Not now. The woman brought her a cup of tea, and Sarah took it gratefully, her hands still trembling as she held the warm mug. As she sipped, she thought of the stranger, the man who had saved her. Who had been he? And what had he known? Sarah didn't have the answers, but one thing was certain. She couldn't go back. Not to that house. Not to him. Her life had changed forever. And the truth was, she didn't know what was waiting for her next. The steam from the tea curled upward, the warmth sinking into her chilled hands. But it couldn't thaw the frozen sense of fear that gripped her chest. Sarah's mind raced as she sat there, staring at the half-empty mug. The sirens had faded into the distance, and yet the unease didn't leave her. What had she just escaped? The man who had been her husband had tried to kill her. And the stranger, who had saved her, intervened at the last possible moment, was still a mystery. The woman who had offered her tea sat across from her, silent, letting Sarah collect her thoughts. It was the kind of quiet that screamed louder than words, as if the world was waiting for something, waiting for her to speak. "Are you sure you're okay?" the woman asked gently, breaking the silence. Her voice felt like a lifeline, something that grounded Sarah in the present. She nodded slowly, taking a shaky breath. "I don't know. I don't know what happened," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's eyes softened with understanding. "You don't have to explain," she said. "But you're safe now. That's all that matters." Sarah stared down at the tea, the words sinking in. Safe. She was safe. But it didn't feel real. Not yet. Her thoughts were still swirling. Too many questions, too many unanswered pieces. Who had that man been? And why had he saved her? How did he know what was happening inside her home? Her mind tugged at the dark memories, the images of her husband's face twisted in malice. The silence in the store was deafening now, suffocating. A question that had been building inside her for hours finally bubbled to the surface. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice raw. The woman seemed to ponder the question for a moment before she spoke again. "Well, first, you need to decide what to do with yourself," she said softly. "You can't go back there. You're not safe there anymore." Her words were like a slap, reminding Sarah of the nightmare she had just escaped. Her home, her marriage, all of it was gone, destroyed in one moment. Her hands shook again, but she set the cup down, forcing herself to stay steady. The woman stood up, walking to the door. "I'm going to call the police," she said. "They need to know what happened. You don't need to face this alone." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but the woman was already on the phone, her voice calm and firm as she gave the details. It didn't matter what Sarah thought. The truth was she needed help. The tears that had been threatening to break free for hours finally spilled down her cheeks. She wasn't sure what was more overwhelming, the pain of the betrayal or the fear that still lingered like a shadow, following her every move. Her life was fractured beyond recognition, but she was still here, still alive. And somehow, that was all she could hold on to for now. The woman's calm voice on the phone felt like the only thing keeping Sarah tethered to reality. The words blurred together, but she could hear the urgency behind them, the determination to get help. The tears continued to fall, but this time, she didn't try to hold them back. She let them flow freely. The warmth of the store seemed to mock her. How could it feel so safe, so comforting, when her world had just been torn apart? Her mind kept replaying the horror from earlier. The knife, the chilling smile on her husband's face, the feeling of being utterly powerless. She could still feel the weight of his gaze on her, even though he was miles away by now. Would he come for her again? Would he try to finish what he had started? The questions swirled in her head, a constant hum of anxiety, and all she could do was sit there, trying to steady her breath. The woman finished her call and returned to Sarah's side, sitting down across from her again. "We'll get you the help you need," she said softly, her voice full of compassion. "I don't know what to do," Sarah whispered, her words breaking through the silence like a plea. "I can't go back. I don't even know where to go." The woman gave a reassuring smile. "You don't have to decide everything right now.
Take it one step at a time."
You've survived this, Sarah. That's all that matters for now." Her words had a strange, calming effect on Sarah, as though the woman's quiet strength was something she could borrow for just a moment. But even as she tried to calm herself, doubt gnawed at her. Would she ever feel safe again? Would she ever be able to trust anyone again, after what her husband had done? Her heart ached with the loss of the man she had once known, the life they had built together, the dreams they had shared. All of it was gone, shattered in an instant. The store was quiet, the only sounds now the occasional hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the distant noises of the street outside. The stranger who had saved her was still a mystery.
Who was he?
Why had he shown up when he did? But Sarah couldn't focus on that right now. Her mind was too clouded, too exhausted from the shock to think clearly. The woman reached out, placing a comforting hand on Sarah's. "We'll figure this out, one thing at a time." Sarah nodded, her head heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. And then, for the first time since she had run from the house, she allowed herself to close her eyes, to rest. She wasn't sure what the future would bring. She didn't know where she'd go from here, or if she would ever feel normal again. But right now, in this moment, she was alive. And that was enough. Sarah kept her eyes closed, her hands trembling in her lap as she tried to steady her breathing. The stillness in the store felt almost surreal, as if time itself had slowed down. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, the warmth of the tea long forgotten, the woman beside her offering no judgment, just quiet, steady comfort. Her mind, though, was anything but calm. It kept racing. Her husband's face kept flashing in her thoughts, twisted and angry, the knife raised, his words cutting deeper than anything physical could. She could still feel the air around her, thick with the weight of what he had planned for her, the chill of knowing that she had almost become his victim. And then there was the stranger, the man who had burst in at the last moment, saving her from whatever fate her husband had intended. Who was he? Why had he come? Had he been watching? Had he known? Questions filled her head, each one more urgent than the last, but her body felt like it had been drained of energy. "Sarah?" The woman's voice broke through the haze, soft and gentle. Sarah looked up, her vision blurry from the tears and exhaustion. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to start over." Her voice cracked as she spoke, the weight of the words more than she could bear. The woman didn't rush to answer. Instead, she simply gave Sarah a moment to breathe, her gaze understanding, unhurried. "You don't have to have all the answers now," she said finally, her voice steady. "You're not alone in this. It's going to be hard, but you don't have to face it by yourself." Her words offered a sense of grounding, but they didn't erase the storm inside Sarah's mind. She couldn't go back to her old life. It was gone, torn apart by betrayal and violence. What was she supposed to do now? Suddenly, a sound broke the quiet. A car door slamming outside. Sarah's heart lurched, the sound of footsteps approaching making her jump in her seat.
Was it him?
Had he somehow found her already? Her body tensed, ready to flee, but the woman seemed unfazed, as if she had anticipated this moment. The door to the store opened, and two police officers stepped in. One of them, a tall man with short, dark hair, looked at Sarah with concern. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, his voice calm but serious. She felt a wave of relief wash over her at the sight of them, but it was quickly replaced by a fresh wave of fear. The nightmare wasn't over yet. They had come. They were here to help. But the journey ahead felt daunting, uncertain. Sarah's voice faltered as she tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The woman beside her spoke up, filling the silence. "She's been through a lot. She's safe here for now." The officer nodded, his eyes softening as he addressed Sarah. "We're going to take care of this. But we need to hear what happened." Sarah's stomach twisted. Her world was shifting again, and now it was becoming real. She couldn't avoid it any longer. The truth had to come out. She had to face it. Her hands tightened around the edge of the table as she forced herself to speak. I was married. My husband, he tried to kill me." Her voice broke, but she didn't stop. She had to keep going. "I don't know why. I don't know what happened." The officer nodded, his face hardening with understanding. "We'll figure it out, ma'am. You're not alone in this." And for the first time since everything had turned upside down, Sarah allowed herself to believe him. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this. A way to rebuild her life. But it wouldn't happen overnight. The road ahead would be long. But for now, Sarah was safe. And that was the first step. The officer sat down across from her, his expression serious but kind. He looked at Sarah with an intensity that told her he wasn't just hearing the words, he was understanding them. "We'll need to hear everything you can remember," he said softly, his voice gentle but firm. "And anything that might help us get you the protection you need." Sarah's hands trembled as she looked down at them, still feeling the shock of everything that had just happened. She was finally beginning to process it, but it felt like a floodgate had opened. The memories and the terror were rushing in, too much to handle all at once. But the officer was waiting, patient. The woman beside her gave a reassuring nod, encouraging her. Taking a deep breath, Sarah wiped the tears that had fallen. She looked up at the officer, her voice fragile but determined. She started, her voice shaking. "He wasn't like this before. We had problems, yes. But he never showed this side of himself." She paused, struggling to find the words to explain the man she had once loved, the man she had married, and the stranger who had attacked her that night. Something changed. I don't know when, but over time, he became more distant, more angry. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her own words. And then it got worse. He started talking about things, saying things that didn't make sense, like he wasn't in his right mind. "But I never thought." She stopped herself, tears flooding her eyes again. She couldn't finish the thought. The officer, seeing the pain in her eyes, leaned forward slightly. "You don't have to relive it all right now, Sarah.
We just need to know what happened tonight. Can you tell me what led up to this?"
Sarah nodded, taking another shaky breath as she gathered her thoughts. "It started with an argument. It wasn't anything new, small things like usual. But tonight it felt different. He was yelling, saying things I couldn't make sense of, accusing me of things that didn't even make sense. And then it escalated so fast. I thought he was going to hurt me before, but this was different." Her voice faltered again, but she pressed on. "He grabbed a knife. And I thought." Her throat closed up. She couldn't finish that sentence. The officer didn't rush her. He simply nodded, listening carefully. Then the stranger. She continued, her voice still unsteady.
He came in.
He must have heard something. He must have known I was in danger. The officer exchanged a quick glance with his partner, but said nothing, allowing Sarah to continue. The stranger, he stopped him. He took the knife away. Her chest tightened as she relived the moment. I don't even know who he is. I don't know why he was there, but he saved my life. The officer leaned back, processing the information. He nodded again, his face a mixture of sympathy and professionalism. We'll find out who he is, don't worry. But right now, I need to make sure you're safe. We'll arrange for you to stay somewhere secure until we can get to the bottom of this. Sarah nodded weakly, feeling a small shred of relief. She had escaped. She was safe for now. But the unease was still there, the gnawing uncertainty. She hadn't felt true safety in so long. Her life had been shattered, and she didn't know how to begin picking up the pieces. The officer looked at her one more time. We're going to handle this, Sarah. You're not alone anymore. She wasn't sure if she believed him, but for the first time since the terror had begun, she wanted to. The future was uncertain, and the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But at that moment, with the police here, with the warmth of the store surrounding her, she finally felt like there might be a way forward. Maybe, just maybe, she could rebuild her life. The officer's words, though comforting, didn't fully quiet the storm. Storm inside Sarah. She tried to focus on what was in front of her. The warm cup of tea she hadn't finished, the sound of the police outside preparing for the next steps, the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat, still quick with fear. But every time she tried to steady herself, her thoughts would race again. The image of her husband, his rage twisted beyond recognition, haunted her. His face would not leave her mind. The anger, the violence, the knife in his hand. She clutched the edge of the table, the coolness of it grounding her. But the weight of what had happened, and the reality of her new life, felt suffocating. The officer stood, ready to move forward with the investigation, but before he left, he turned to Sarah one last time. We're going to help you, Sarah. We'll make sure your husband doesn't get the chance to hurt you again. We'll find him, and we'll make sure you're protected. She nodded, though her thoughts were still swirling. The promise of protection was comforting, but her mind wouldn't let her rest. She needed answers. She needed to know who the stranger was, why he had been there, and most importantly, she needed to know what her future would look like now. The officer's partner stepped forward, handing her a business card. This is our contact information. If you remember anything else, anything at all, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Sarah took the card, feeling the weight of it in her hand. The seriousness in their eyes only reinforced the gravity of the situation. She had lived through a nightmare, and the aftermath was just beginning. As the officers stepped outside, Sarah's mind replayed the scene from earlier, her husband's face, the stranger's intervention. The thought of that knife, poised to end her life, was too much to bear. But now, as she sat in the quiet store, she understood something else. She was alive. She had made it out, and no matter how dark the road ahead seemed, there was still hope. There were people who cared, who wanted to help. She wasn't alone anymore. The woman who had taken her and stood up, walking over to her with a gentle smile. Come on, let's get you somewhere safe, where you can rest. Sarah looked up at her, her gratitude overwhelming. She didn't know what she would have done without her, without this moment of unexpected kindness in the midst of everything. With shaky legs, Sarah stood and allowed the woman to lead her outside. The chill in the air hit her as she stepped onto the pavement, but this time, it wasn't as overwhelming. She had made it out. She was safe. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to breathe without the weight of impending danger hanging over her. The future was unknown, uncertain, but Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a flicker of hope. And with that hope, she took the first step toward a new life, one where she would rebuild, one where she would finally be free. No matter what came next, The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, police interviews, and the steady hum of daily life that Sarah had once known, but now felt distant and foreign. The stranger who had saved her, the man who had intervened in the most terrifying moment of her life, remained an enigma. No one knew who he was, and despite the police's best efforts, his identity remained a mystery. But as time passed, Sarah began to realize that the stranger was something more than just a hero in that moment. He was a symbol of her escape, a shadow of the life she had once taken for granted, but one she could never return to. Her husband had been arrested, but the damage had been done. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted, was gone, replaced by a monster who had tried to take her life. And no matter how many times she told herself that she was safe now, the ache of betrayal gnawed at her. The police continued their investigation, gathering evidence and piecing together the fragments of the life Sarah had once shared with her husband. But every discovery felt like a new wound, each revelation deeper and harder to bear.
His lies.
His secret life. The twisted mind that had harbored such violence beneath the surface. As the weeks stretched into months, Sarah started the slow, painful process of rebuilding her life. She moved into a new apartment, away from the house where everything had gone wrong. But the newness of it felt hollow, like a shell she was still trying to grow into. She took walks in the park, letting the fresh air soothe her frayed nerves. Sometimes, she would see couples walking hand in hand, and it would remind her of what she had lost, the hope she once had for a future with someone she trusted. But then, she would remind herself that she had survived. And that survival meant everything. One evening, as she sat in her new apartment, staring out the window at the city lights, Sarah realized something. She had made it. Against all odds, she had survived. And no matter what came next, she would face it, because she was stronger than she had ever known. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time since that night, she felt ready to walk it. She was free. And that, at least, was enough. Months had passed since Sarah's life had been torn apart. The world outside her window had gone on as it always had, indifferent to the chaos she had lived through.
But she had changed.
She was no longer the woman who had stood trembling in the corner of her home, terrified for her life. She was something different now, something stronger. The nightmares had faded, though they still whispered at the edges of her sleep. She had learned to live with the uncertainty, the quiet discomfort that came from starting over. Every day was a small victory. She woke up each morning and reminded herself that she was alive. She was free. One evening, as the sun set, casting the apartment in a soft golden light, Sarah sat on her balcony, looking out over the city. The lights below twinkled like stars, far away but somehow close. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. The road to healing had been long and painful, but she had found small joys along the way. She had joined a support group, found solace in the stories of others who had walked through their own darkness and come out stronger. She had even started volunteering at a local shelter, offering a listening ear to those who, like her, had once felt like they were lost in a world of shadows. She had come to realize that the life she had once known, the one with her husband, was not the only path forward. It had been a chapter, but it was no longer her story. The woman she was becoming had the power to write her own ending. As the evening air grew cooler, Sarah stood up, stretching as the weight of the past seemed to lift just a little. There was still pain, still loss. But there was also hope. And that hope had a way of growing stronger with each passing day. She wasn't sure where the future would take her, but she was ready to face it, ready to live without fear, to reclaim the pieces of herself that had been lost. For the first time, she felt as if she could breathe, truly breathe, and live again.
And that was enough. The end.